In the final turbulent years of World War II, the skies over Europe became an arena where the future of aerial warfare was being tested. Among the most extraordinary sights to emerge from this desperate period was the glint of metal that moved too fast to be a piston-engine plane. The German Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was unlike anything Allied pilots had ever seen. It was sleek, dangerous, and unnervingly quick. When it first appeared, even seasoned combat veterans could scarcely believe their eyes. The Me 262 represented a revolutionary leap. It was a culmination of years of German aeronautical research aimed at breaking the limits of propeller-driven flight. Its two Junkers Jumo 004B turbojet engines gave it a top speed of over 540 miles per hour, easily 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters of time. For the Luftwaffe pilots who climbed into its cockpit, it was as if they were stepping into the future. In those desperate late months of the war, when Germany was collapsing under relentless Allied bombing, the arrival of the Me 262 offered a brief, intoxicating sense of superiority. Pilots who had spent years flying Bf-109s or FW-190s suddenly found themselves with a machine that could outrun everything in the sky. Some of them called it the Schwalbe, or Swallow, a graceful, predatory bird streaking across the heavens. Others, more cynical, called it the Turbo. Knowing how temperamental its engines were, the Me 262 was introduced under chaotic conditions. Hitler's obsession with turning every weapon into a bomber delayed its proper deployment as a fighter, but once it finally entered service, it began to show what it could do. The first jet squadrons, commanded by aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Nowotny, were small, but they made headlines. They would roar into Allied bomber formations at speeds the enemy gunners couldn't track, fire their 30mm cannons, and peel away before anyone could react. For the Luftwaffe pilots, it was intoxicating. At last, after years of being outnumbered and outclimbed, they had something that gave them an edge. The psychological effect was enormous. These pilots began to flaunt their new machines. They would make low passes over airfields or over German towns, streaking past at hundreds of miles an hour, leaving witnesses stunned. Some pilots even performed unauthorized maneuvers, rolls, dives, and climbs meant to show off the jet's power. Word spread among bomber crews. They've got jets now. The Me 262 seemed unstoppable at first. Allied intelligence officers wrote urgent reports describing the new German aircraft and its unprecedented speed. Many feared that if Germany could build the jets in significant numbers, it might reverse the course of the air war. Allied High Command ordered fighter squadrons to keep a lookout and to avoid trying to chase jets in level flight. It was pointless. Instead, bomber groups were instructed to tighten formations and rely on mutual defensive fire, hoping that the jets would break off before inflicting too much damage. But the Germans faced huge problems. The Me 262's engines were primitive by modern standards, early jet turbines that often failed after only a few dozen hours of flight. They were slow to spool up, making takeoffs and landings treacherous. The runways themselves were constantly targeted by Allied fighter bombers, and Germany's fuel reserves were vanishing. Still, in the cockpit, none of that mattered. For the men who flew it, the Me 262 felt like salvation. Pilots described the sensation of pushing the throttle forward and feeling the jet accelerate with no vibration. No propeller torque, no drag. Just a smooth surge of thrust that made them feel almost weightless. When they broke through a cloud layer and saw the sun glinting off the silver fuselage, they felt as if they were piloting something not of this world. Some, in their diaries, compare it to riding a comet. The pride of being part of this elite jet force gave rise to a certain arrogance. Luftwaffe pilots began to taunt their Allied counterparts in radio chatter, calling attention to the new age that had arrived. There were reports of German pilots buzzing Allied reconnaissance aircraft, making daring close passes just to show off their speed. A few Me 262 units even developed informal rituals before combat, standing on the runway beside their sleek jets, joking that they were the first men of the next century. It was bravado masking desperation. Germany in late 1944 was under siege from all sides. Fuel was scarce, replacement parts scarce, airfields bombed daily, and the skies thick with Allied aircraft. The Me 262 was introduced into this chaos, a miracle machine flown by men with almost no time to train. Many pilots transitioning from piston fighters struggled to adapt to the jet's quirks: the slower throttle response, the fragile engines, the higher landing speed. The Luftwaffe's command structure was disintegrating, and Hitler's interference made matters worse. He insisted that the Me-262 be used as a bomber rather than a fighter, a decision that infuriated officers like Galland, who knew its only real value lay in intercepting Allied bombers. Even so, the first combat flights were spectacular. On July 26, 1944, test pilot Major Walter Nowotny downed several Allied aircraft in his Me-262, making him the first jet ace in history. The legend grew. Allied crews began calling the Me-262 blowjobs, or jets, describing them as silver meteors that could appear out of nowhere, strike, and vanish. Reports of bomber formations shredded by jet attacks spread through the ranks. The pilots flying Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires found themselves both fascinated and frustrated. They wanted to fight these new machines, to prove that skill could overcome speed, but they rarely got the chance. The jets would appear for a few seconds, streak past, and disappear into the distance. For the Germans, that fleeting superiority felt glorious. They had been outnumbered and outgunned for so long that having an aircraft which could dominate the sky was intoxicating. There was even a sense of moral restoration. Here was proof, they told themselves, that German engineering still led the world. In their brief moments of triumph, they seemed to forget the burning cities below, the crumbling front lines, and the inevitability of defeat. Yet beneath the pride, cracks were already showing. Many Me-262s never reached operational units because they were destroyed on the ground during Allied bombings. The jets required long, smooth runways that were increasingly hard to maintain. Allied reconnaissance planes began mapping out the airfields where the Me-262s operated, and fighter bombers began prowling nearby. Still, in those first few months, the German jet pilots held their heads high. To them, they weren't merely defending a dying Reich. They were test pilots of a new age, warriors of a technological dawn that the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet. They flew with defiant pride, knowing that their aircraft was faster, more advanced, and unlike anything the enemy had. Every time they took off, the roar of their jet engines seemed to announce to the world that Germany still had something to boast about. But even as they flaunted their new jets, Allied pilots were watching, learning, and adapting. Somewhere high above the clouds, Mustang aces were beginning to plan how they could turn the tables on the jets that had humiliated them. The Germans didn't yet know it, but the very advantage they flaunted, that need to show off their speed and superiority, would soon become the key to their undoing. By late 1944, the Messerschmitt Me 262 had become both a symbol of pride and a symbol of frustration within the Luftwaffe. Its pilots adored it, its enemies feared it, and its mechanics cursed it. Each day, the jets roared off battered runways surrounded by wreckage and bomb craters, while Allied reconnaissance planes circled high above, tracking every movement. The once mighty Luftwaffe was now fighting a losing battle in the air, but in the minds of the German pilots who flew these sleek machines, there still flickered the idea that the Me-262 could somehow change everything. The early encounters had given them confidence. They had swooped through bomber formations like hawks diving into flocks of geese, raking B-17s and B-24s with 30mm cannon shells that tore through aluminum as if it were paper. Gunners who managed to fire back described the jets as silver streaks. There for a second, gone the next. Each time when the jets roared to the sky, the bomber crews felt a jolt of terror. But those victories masked deeper problems. For every jet that returned safely, there was another that flamed out or broke down. The jet engines were fragile masterpieces, designed with materials that Germany could no longer produce in abundance. Shortages of high-temperature alloys meant the blades warped and cracked after a few flights. Mechanics worked around the clock in freezing hangars, cannibalizing wrecked machines to keep others running. The ground crews were heroes in their own right, crawling under cold fuselages at night as Allied bombers thundered overhead. Despite these hardships, the pilots carried themselves with swagger. When they climbed out of their cockpits, faces blackened with soot, they would light cigarettes and joke that they were untouchable. Allied fighters couldn't catch them, they said. The jets were too fast. Even Galland, who by then was disillusioned with Hitler's leadership, admitted privately that the aircraft was a miracle of flight. Many of the young pilots believed the war could still be turned around. They imagined entire squadrons of jets cutting through bomber streams, annihilating the enemy's industrial lifeline. But dreams of mass production were fading. Allied raids on manufacturing plants in Augsburg and Regensburg slowed assembly lines to a crawl. Every new jet had to be ferried under cover of night, hidden in forests, dispersed across makeshift airstrips. The Luftwaffe's once efficient network of bases had been shattered. Each new Me-262 was precious, and every pilot knew that losing one wasn't just a personal risk. It was a national tragedy. Still, in the skies, the jets made their mark. Their speed gave them near impunity, and their 4 cannons could destroy a bomber with a short burst. Whenever Me-262s took off to intercept Allied formations, they climbed like ghosts out of the morning mist, their twin engines leaving faint trails of vapor. Allied bomber crews learned to dread that sight. They would hear the warning calls over the intercom, "Jets, 12 o'clock high," and then the sudden hammering of cannon fire. Pilots would feel the shudder of hits, see wings torn apart, and then the enemy was gone. Yet for all the fear they inspired, the jets rarely stayed in the fight for long. Their fuel tanks were small, their ammunition limited, and their engines overheated easily. The pilots were ordered to strike fast, disengage, and return before Allied fighters could converge. The Americans, however, were not passive spectators. The U.S. 8th Air Force had learned to adapt faster than any air arm in history. Every mission was a classroom, every loss a lesson. By the winter of 1944, the P-51 Mustang, with its long range and high speed, had become the most formidable escort fighter in the world. Pilots who had spent months dueling with FW-190s and BF-109s began analyzing the new jet's behavior. Intelligence officers debriefed bomber crews and tracked reports, where the jets appeared, how fast they approached, when they ran out of fuel. The data painted a picture of vulnerability. The Me-262 was unbeatable in a straight chase, but was weak at low speeds. Its engines took precious seconds to throttle up, and when it was on final approach to land, it moved no faster than any piston fighter. Allied commanders began to devise a plan. They would catch the jets where their speed advantage meant nothing, at their bases. Mustang pilots started flying long-range sweeps around known jet airfields. They climbed high, sometimes 20,000 feet above, and loitered silently, waiting for a glint of metal below. They called this tactic rat-catching. The first time it worked, the effect was electric. A low Me-262 was spotted approaching to land. Its pilot, thinking himself safe, lowered his gear and flaps, unaware of the 4 Mustangs diving like hawks from the sun. In a burst of gunfire, the world's fastest fighter was shredded before it even touched down. Word spread among Allied units. The jets could be beaten if you were patient and clever. Meanwhile, on the German side, morale was cracking. Pilots were dying not in combat, but in takeoff accidents, engine failures, or surprise attacks near their bases. The Me-262 had to accelerate carefully. If the throttle was advanced too quickly, the engine could flame out or explode. Many new pilots were too inexperienced to handle it. Some never even reached altitude before disaster struck. Those who did began to realize that their airfields had become death traps. Every time they prepared to land, they scanned the skies nervously, expecting P-51s to appear out of nowhere. Ground crews started mounting anti-aircraft guns near runways, and Me-262s began using zigzag, landing approaches to make themselves harder to ambush. But the Americans learned to adapt even to that. They attacked in pairs, one fighter diving while the other circled high, ready to strike if the jet tried to escape. In Berlin, the Luftwaffe command grew desperate. Galen, now openly at odds with Hermann Göring, tried to organize an elite unit of veteran pilots to fly the jets more effectively. He called it Jagerband 44, a special squadron of aces. They painted bright red undersides on their Me-262s to distinguish themselves and flew with extraordinary skill. They scored victories against both bombers and fighters, and for a moment it seemed as though the German jets might regain some dominance. But there were too few of them and too many enemies. Allied bombers kept coming, day after day, escorted by hundreds of Mustangs. The skies over Germany were no longer a battlefield of equals. They were a storm of metal where even the fastest machine couldn't find safety. Despite the worsening odds, the Me-262 pilots clung to their pride. They still believed that, in a fair fight, their jets were superior to anything else in the world. And in truth, in one-on-one duels at altitude, they were. The Me-262 could leave a Mustang behind in seconds. But the Americans had learned that wars aren't won by single duels. They're won by numbers, coordination, and strategy. Every time the jets flew, the Allies adapted. Radar stations tracked their takeoffs. Reconnaissance aircraft followed their routes, and fighter groups adjusted patrols to intercept them. The once mysterious silver streaks were no longer unpredictable. They were targets plotted on maps and studied by analysts. As winter turned to spring, the balance of fears shifted. The German pilots still flaunted their speed. Some even made reckless passes over Allied columns just to prove they could, but the pride had become hollow. They were flying into a sky that no longer belonged to them. Each sortie carried the risk of being ambushed, each landing a prayer. They knew the Americans were waiting, invisible until the last second. Yet they flew anyway, because to them the Me-262 was more than a weapon. It was the last flame of a dying air force. They were determined to show the world that German skill and technology could still command respect. And in a sense, they succeeded. For even their enemies admired the aircraft. Among the Mustang pilots, fascination grew into obsession. They began talking about jet hunting with the same mixture of fear and excitement that once surrounded dueling aces. Every pilot wanted to be the first to claim a kill over the new German wonder weapon. They studied photos, rehearsed attack angles, memorized the layout of Me-262 bases. The chase had become personal. The Americans wanted to prove that courage and experience could defeat even the most advanced machine on Earth. And soon they would, because while the Germans flaunted their new jets in bold, high-speed passes and public demonstrations, they were also revealing patterns. They took off from the same fields, landed at predictable times, and relied on narrow windows of daylight when visibility was good. Allied pilots, patient and relentless, began to exploit those patterns. The stage was set for the great confrontations to come, moments when propeller met jet, when old technology and new collided in the smoke-filled skies over a dying Reich. The Germans didn't realize it yet, but their very pride, their willingness to flaunt their jets and show what they could do, had given the Americans all the clues they needed. The Me-262 had changed the rules of air combat, but the Mustang pilots were about to change them again. The hunters would soon become the hunted. The early months of 1945 brought a strange kind of war to the European skies. The Me-262s still screamed across the clouds with breathtaking speed, but they were no longer mysterious phantoms. They were hunted creatures, tracked and stalked by the patient, relentless pilots of the U.S. Army Air Forces. What had begun as awe and fear had turned into a calculated campaign to break the back of the Luftwaffe's last hope. The Mustang pilots had learned their lesson well. They had stopped trying to chase the jets in level flight. That was suicide. Instead, they waited, studied, and struck when the Germans were weakest. The airfields that once symbolized German technological pride had become traps. The great concrete runways at Akmer, Rain, and Lechfeld were ringed with bomb craters, their hangars camouflaged under nets and trees. Allied reconnaissance planes photographed them daily, and the images were rushed to briefing rooms in England and France. There, young men with calm eyes and worn leather jackets memorized every taxiway and approach path. They knew that when the Me-262s lifted off, they would follow a predictable arc into the sky, slowly gaining speed until the engines reached full thrust. That moment, those first few seconds, was when they were most vulnerable. The first major success came when Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew of the 361st Fighter Group spotted two Me-262s taking off from Akmer Airfield. Drew had heard the rumors for weeks that the jets could not be caught unless you hit them at takeoff. Now he saw his chance. The morning air was crisp and cold, visibility perfect. He was flying high above the field when he saw them rise, two sleek silver shapes accelerating down the runway. Without hesitation, he pushed his Mustang into a dive. The air screamed past his canopy as his aircraft plunged toward the enemy. He lined up his gun sight, felt his thumb press the trigger, and in an instant the first jet erupted in flames. The second tried to pull away, banking hard, but Drew followed through, his 6.50 caliber guns hammering. The Me-262's right engine caught fire. Its wing tore apart, and it spiraled into the ground. It was over in seconds. Drew pulled up, astonished by the speed of it all, his adrenaline spiking. He had just done what many believed impossible. He had shot down 2 German jets in one pass. When word of the encounter reached Allied command, the effect was electric. Pilots gathered in mess halls, retelling the story with growing excitement. It could be done. The myth of invincibility was broken. Now every Mustang pilot wanted a jet kill. In briefing rooms, commanders emphasized the tactics that had worked for Drew. Attack when they're taking off, stay high, dive fast, and never chase a jet in a climb. The Americans were turning the Germans' own arrogance against them. The Me-262 pilots still believed in their machine, but they were beginning to sense the net closing in. Each flight was a test of nerves. They could no longer take off with confidence, knowing that somewhere above, an invisible predator might be circling. They took to using elaborate launch patterns, feigning takeoffs, circling low before gaining altitude, even sending decoys ahead. But the Mustangs adapted again. They waited longer, higher, sometimes 30 minutes at a time, throttles barely ticking over, eyes scanning the clouds for any flash of sunlight on metal. By February 1945, the air war over Germany had become a deadly chess match. The Me-262s were used primarily as bomber interceptors, launching rocket attacks against the vast U.S. bomber streams that still pounded German cities. When they hit hard. B-17s exploded in midair, their wings sheared away by 30mm cannon shells. But for every successful attack, the Germans paid dearly. Allied escort fighters now shadowed every mission, ready to swoop down the moment a jet appeared. At one of these airfields, Lechfeld, Major Walter Nowotny's old unit had been reformed under different leadership. The pilots that were among the best the Luftwaffe still had, men with hundreds of kills to their names. But even they could not stem the tide. Allied raids destroyed hangars faster than they could be rebuilt. Spare parts had to be smuggled in by truck at night. Many pilots slept in their cockpits, knowing that if an alarm came, they would have only minutes to scramble, and the Allies never let them rest. Mustang squadrons began prowling the skies over known jet bases every morning and evening, the times when Me-262s usually launched. They called these rat hunts, and they became a grim routine. A typical day might see a squadron of P-51s cruising at 25,000 feet, scanning the horizon. Suddenly, a flash below, a jet lifting off, the telltale heat shimmer from its engines. The Mustangs would dive, screaming downward, tracers arcing through the air. Sometimes a jet pilot never even knew he was being attacked until the first rounds tore into his fuselage. Those that survived would jettison their bombs and flee, but few escaped unscathed. In March 1945, the 55th Fighter Group scored what became one of the most famous ambushes of the war. They had been patrolling near Parkham Airfield when a formation of Me-262s came into land. The American pilots rolled over into steep dives, guns blazing. Within minutes, 6 German jets were burning on the runway. The Luftwaffe commander, watching from the control tower, could only stare in disbelief. The pride of German aviation had been slaughtered before it even left the ground. The surviving pilots were shaken. Some began painting camouflage on the undersides of their jets. Others begged for radar warning systems that never arrived. They developed new takeoff procedures, climbing vertically at full throttle to escape the Mustangs, but it only bought them moments of safety. The Americans had radar coverage now, too, and ground controllers guided fighters toward every departing jet. Among the Mustang aces, the hunt for jets became almost ritualistic. They studied weather maps, wind direction, even the timing of German operations. Pilots like Chuck Yeager, Bud Anderson, and Don Bryan knew that the Me-262 represented not just a new enemy, but a glimpse of the future. And they were determined to prove that skill and courage could still outmatch technology. Yeager himself would later say that the jet wasn't invincible, just fast. You couldn't outrun one, he said, but you could outthink one. Every successful interception made the German pilots more cautious. They began flying in pairs or threes, taking off under the cover of flak guns. They learned to shut down one engine during landing approaches to save fuel, gliding silently in, hoping the Mustangs wouldn't notice. But they were always noticed. The Americans had developed an uncanny sixth sense for where the jets would appear. The very pride that had once driven the German pilots to flaunt their new machines had become their weakness. They couldn't resist showing what the Me-262 could do, climbing fast, diving low, blazing through Allied formations. And every time they did, they revealed more about their tactics, their bases, their patterns. Inside the Me-262 cockpit, the experience of combat was both exhilarating and terrifying. The pilot sat in a small armored tub surrounded by instruments that looked futuristic compared to older fighters. When he advanced the throttles, the engine screamed and the jets surged forward like a living thing. In a matter of seconds, it was airborne, climbing faster than any propeller-driven plane. The sensation of speed was intoxicating. The pilot felt untouchable, until he looked back and saw the tiny specks of Mustangs diving from above. That was when the terror came. At those low altitudes, with engines slow to respond, there was no escape. A Mustang diving from 20,000 feet could close the distance in seconds, its gun spitting fire. The jet's superior top speed was useless if it never reached it. Many pilots tried evasive rolls or sudden dives, but the Me-262's control surfaces were sluggish at low speed, and the fragile engines couldn't handle rapid throttle changes. Some pilots died not from enemy fire, but from engine stalls, crashes, or flameouts while trying to escape. Still, the Luftwaffe refused to give up. Adolf Gallen's Jaguar Band 44, a hand-picked unit of elite aces, fought with astonishing bravery. They flew in tight formations, using hit-and-run tactics, attacking bombers at 600 miles per hour before the escorts could react. Their aircraft carried red markings that made them unmistakable in the sky, a challenge to the enemy and a badge of defiance. For weeks, they managed to hold their own, shooting down several bombers and fighters. But even Gallen's men could not overcome the crushing odds. The Allies were flying thousands of sorties a day. Germany could barely get a few dozen jets into the air. Each mission became a gamble. Some pilots compared it to Russian roulette. Sooner or later, your number came up. They had started the war as hunters, proud, fearless, unstoppable. Now they were the hunted, yet they flew on, driven by duty, pride, and the faint hope that if they could destroy just one more bomber, one more target, it might make a difference. For the Mustang pilots, the thrill of bringing down a jet was unlike anything else. They would return to base, adrenaline still pumping, the smell of gunpowder in the cockpit, and land to cheers from their ground crews. Their kills were celebrated in newspapers, proof that the Allies could overcome even the enemy's most advanced weapons. But privately, many of them respected the Me-262 pilots deeply. They knew how dangerous those flights were, how brave a man had to be to take off a machine that might fail at any second while facing impossible odds. By April 1945, the skies over Germany were chaos. Smoke and contrails crisscrossed the heavens. Burning aircraft fell like meteors from the clouds. The Me-262 still flew, but each sortie was a whisper against a hurricane. The Mustangs were everywhere, and the jet fields were dying one by one under Allied bombs. The Germans had entered the jet age, but too late with too little. The Americans had proven that brains, discipline, and timing could outfight even the fastest machine. And in the coming weeks, as Germany's cities fell and its armies collapsed, the last remaining Me-262 pilots would take off on missions they knew could only end one way, a desperate gesture of pride from men who refused to surrender the sky. By April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing faster than anyone could comprehend. The Third Reich was dying. Cities lay in ruins, and yet in a few scattered airfields across Bavaria and central Germany, a handful of pilots still climbed into their Me-262 jets and roared toward the sky. They knew the end was coming, yet they flew anyway. The runways were cratered, the fuel drums nearly empty, the mechanics half-starved and exhausted, but the pilots refused to stop. Each flight was an act of defiance, a final salute to belief that skill and courage could somehow redeem the catastrophe consuming their country. The Allied air forces owned the sky now. There was no safe altitude, no secret base, no refuge in the constant rumble of engines overhead. Long before the jets could even start their turbines, the sound of distant bombing rolled across the fields. It was a hopeless situation, but within that hopelessness lay a strange, fierce pride. The men who flew the Me-262s called themselves the last knights of the air. They had no illusions left about victory. What drove them was loyalty to one another, to their craft, to the idea that Germany had given birth to something extraordinary, the first true jet fighter in history, and that it deserved to be remembered not as a failure, but as a glimpse of what could have been. Each sortie began in silence. Mechanics, their uniforms black with oil, pushed the sleek aircraft out of their hiding places beneath trees or wooden shelters. The turbines whined to life, coughing smoke. The pilots strapped in, hands steady, faces grim. Some kissed small crosses or photographs tucked inside their flight suits. The radio chatter was minimal. No bravado now, just clipped acknowledgments and the quiet background of men who knew this might be their last flight. They taxied to the broken runways, dodging bomb craters and debris. The moment the throttles went forward, the world dissolved into vibration and noise. The jets leapt down the strips like arrows released from bows, engines screaming as they clawed for the sky. Up there, the air was thin and sharp. The Me-262 still moved like lightning, slicing through clouds with an elegance unmatched by any propeller-driven plane. For a few moments, every pilot could forget the chaos below. They felt free, as though time itself slowed to watch them. But that illusion never lasted. The Mustangs were waiting, patient, relentless, circling thousands of feet above like hawks. The German pilots knew the pattern now. If they climbed straight, they'd be attacked before their engines reached full power. Some tried zigzagging. Others turned sharply to gain altitude at an angle. But nothing worked forever. The Americans had learned every trick. On April 25, 1945, one of the last great dogfights of the European war unfolded near Munich. A flight of Me-262s from Gallen's Jaguar Band 44 took off to intercept Allied bombers approaching the city. They were met by a swarm of P-51s from the 357 Fighter Group. The sky erupted into chaos, silver and gray streaks diving, rolling, crossing paths at impossible speeds. The Me-262s were faster, but the Mustangs were everywhere. Galland himself, fly with a leg still injured from an earlier crash, scored one last kill before being wounded and forced to land. Several of his comrades never came back. The airfield they launched from was bombed that same afternoon, destroying half the remaining jets on the ground. Elsewhere, at Lechfeld and Parchim, the same story repeated. American fighters patrolled overhead, while Allied bombers cratered runways into dust. German crews tried desperately to repair them at night, filling holes with whatever materials they could find. Fuel was rationed to a few liters per plane. Some pilots were told they could fly only once more. There simply wasn't enough fuel for a return trip, yet still they volunteered. The Me-262 would become a symbol now, not of victory, but of defiance. They wanted to die flying, not surrendering. Among the Allied pilots, the respect for Me-262's design grew even as they destroyed it. After missions, they'd walk around wrecked jets, touching the smooth metal, marveling at its swept wings and turbojets. They knew they were looking at the future. The war had shown them that the age of propellers was ending. The jet had come too late for Germany, but it would define aviation for generations to come. Captured Me-262s were quickly shipped to England and America for testing. Engineers studied every bolt, every turbine, every control surface. Within a few years, the technology would be reborn in new forms. The American F-86 Sabre, the British Meteor, the Soviet MiG-15, all of them tracing their lineage back to those desperate flights in 1945. But in those final days, none of that mattered to men who flew them. They weren't thinking of legacy or engineering marvels. They were thinking of survival, of comrades lost, of the noise and fire that filled their lives. Many jets never made it off the ground. Allied tank columns were closing in, Artillery shells whistle overhead, and sometimes the pilots were ordered to destroy their own planes to prevent capture. Some refused. They sat in their cockpits, engines off, staring at the sky that had once belonged to them. Others took off one last time without orders, vanishing into the clouds, never to be seen again. The day the war ended, silence fell across the airfields. Mechanics wept quietly beside the charred remains of the jets they had spent months keeping alive. The pilots who survived sat together, trading cigarettes and memories. They were beaten men, but not broken. They had flown the most advanced aircraft in the world and survived the most relentless air campaign in history. They had tasted both invincibility and helplessness. For some, the end brought relief. For others, it brought only emptiness. On the Allied side, the victory was complete but sobering. The Mustang pilots who had hunted Me-262s returned home as heroes. Yet they couldn't help but feel awe for the enemy they defeated. They spoke of the jet with reverence, calling it a miracle with bad timing. Many would later capture Me-262s themselves, discovering how stable, how smooth, how astonishingly modern it felt. They realized that had the war lasted another year, or had Germany built hundreds instead of dozens, the skies might have looked very different. The contrast between the two aircraft, the piston-engine Mustang and the jet-powered Me-262, marked a turning point in history. The Mustang represented the perfection of the old world, the pinnacle of piston technology, the triumph of training in numbers and reliability. The Me-262 represented the birth of the new, raw speed, innovation, and the first glimpse of the future that would soon dominate the world's air forces. When they met over Germany, it wasn't just two machines fighting. It was two eras colliding in midair. And yet, in that collision, the old world won. The Mustangs had proven that human ingenuity could adapt faster than any invention. The Germans had believed that technology alone could save them. But the Americans had shown that discipline, teamwork, and timing were the true masters of battle. The Me-262 was faster, but the Mustang pilots were smarter. That lesson echoed long after the guns went silent. As the months passed, Allied engineers walked through the wreckage of the jet fields. They found fragments of twisted engines, scorched runways, burned cockpits. In one hangar, a single Me-262 sat intact, its silver paint dull by soot, its nose pointed toward the sky as if still waiting for takeoff. It had never flown. The engineers took photographs, ran their hands along its fuselage, and felt something like pity. It was a beautiful machine, powerful, tragic, born too late. Years later, when veterans from both sides met, they spoke of those final days with the same mixture of pride and sorrow. The Mustang pilots remembered the thrill of the chase, the adrenaline of diving on the jets. The former Luftwaffe men remembered the fear of seeing black dots in the sun, knowing the Mustangs were coming. But all agreed on one thing. In the sky, there had been respect. For all the horror of war, there was still a strange brotherhood among those who risked their lives in fragile machines. The story of the Me-262 and the Mustangs became one of legend, not merely of technology or tactics, but of human will. It was a story of arrogance humbled, of brilliance crushed by sheer persistence, and of courage on both sides. In the end, the German jets fell not because they were flawed, but because the men flying the Mustangs refused to be intimidated. They studied, adapted, and overcame. When the last Me-262 lifted off into the gray April sky and vanished beyond the horizon, it carried with it the twilight of one age and the dawn of another. The pilots who watched it disappear couldn't have known how their brief, furious struggle would shape the next century of flight. They only knew that for a few shining moments they had touched the future, and that it burned them like fire.